Hello, everyone. After Venezuela, U.S. foreign policy gained something that matters more than any statement or press briefing: a precedent. When a superpower shows it is willing to use force and physically remove a foreign leader, the message goes far beyond one country. It becomes a method. It becomes a reference point, and it instantly changes the way other governments interpret Washington's next move. That is why, almost immediately after the Maduro operation, the next question appeared, out loud, on camera, in a very direct political style. Could Colombia be next? President Trump publicly suggested that an operation against Colombia sounded acceptable, and he framed Colombia in the harshest possible terms, attacking President Gustavo Petro and linking the country to cocaine flows into the United States. Colombia's foreign minister responded with a statement that Colombia's armed forces must be ready to defend the country's sovereignty in case of any hypothetical U.S. invasion. So this is no longer just online speculation. This is already a two-sided exchange of signals, and when signals like this go public, they shape reality even before any decision is made. Now, the main question is what we really mean by next. Do we mean a direct repeat of Venezuela? Same method, same scale, same political logic? Or do we mean the next phase of pressure, where Colombia becomes the next central target of sanctions, intimidation, and show of force tactics? To answer that, we have to think like decision makers: interests, tools, and price. First, the Venezuela operation created controversy inside the United States and abroad. There are competing narratives about the level of violence, casualties, and the broader consequences. And that matters because once a story like this enters the system, it develops its own momentum. Congress starts asking questions. Allies demand explanations. Lawyers debate the boundaries. International institutions discuss legitimacy and precedent. And at home, the public argument becomes less about Venezuela itself and more about what America is willing to do and where the line is. Second, Venezuela is not finished. When Washington uses force, it rarely ends on the day of the operation. It opens the door to a longer game. How to manage the aftermath, who gains control over key resources, how to shape the new balance, and what the new rules become. If the operation is a door, then the next phase is the room you walk into, and that room is always political, economic, and strategic at the same time. Against that background, Colombia enters the picture. From a purely domestic political perspective inside the U.S., Colombia is an easier topic than Venezuela. Why? Because it can be packaged as an extension of the war on drugs. It can be presented as protecting American communities from cocaine, crime, border pressure, and cartel violence. For many American voters, that story feels more immediate than abstract debates about legitimacy in Caracas. But here is the critical detail. Colombia is not Venezuela, neither institutionally nor in terms of its historical relationship with the United States. And that is exactly why a direct Venezuela-style repeat is a far less rational option, even if it makes for dramatic headlines. In Colombia, the sanctions track matters more than the military track. Even before this latest escalation of rhetoric, the U.S. already had a framework for pressure. Sanctions, legal tools, financial restrictions, and reputational risk can be deployed in a way that looks controlled. Washington likes tools that can scale up, adjust, and trade off. Sanctions can be tightened or relaxed. They can be targeted at individuals, networks, and channels. And they can create elite-level stress inside a country without a single shot fired. Now, Colombia also signals that it wants to keep practical cooperation with the U.S. on counter-narcotics. That too matters, because it suggests Bogotá is trying to separate the political conflict at the top from the security cooperation that has existed for years. This is not the posture of a country that wants a full rupture. It is the posture of a government that wants to survive pressure while keeping certain doors open. So what scenarios actually make sense if your video asks, is Colombia next? Let's outline them in a realistic hierarchy, not by drama, but by probability. Scenario 1. Colombia is next as the next target of public intimidation. In this version, the threat of an operation becomes a form of hard diplomacy. Trump uses the Venezuela precedent to amplify credibility. We have done it once, we can do it again. The goal is to force behavioral change without actually pulling the trigger. This approach is cheap. It costs almost nothing to speak. It can generate domestic political benefits, and it can pressure the other side psychologically. The downside is also obvious. It pushes Colombia to mobilize publicly. It strengthens nationalist sentiment. It forces officials to speak about sovereignty and defense. And once this language becomes normal, it becomes harder for both sides to return to a calmer track without looking weak. Scenario 2. Colombia is next as the next step in sanctions and financial isolation. This is the most technocratic and most scalable path. If Washington already has legal and financial instruments in place, expanding the sanctions web is easier than going kinetic. This scenario can become multi-layered. More names, more networks, more restrictions, more reputational toxicity for banks and business partners. The strategic effect is simple. Elites begin to calculate risk differently. Financial channels narrow. Political coalitions strain. The stress grows from within. From a U.S. perspective, this looks clean. It looks like pressure without invasion. It also looks like a policy that can be justified as law enforcement and national security. Scenario 3. Colombia is next as the next operational battlefield around drug logistics. Here the focus is not Bogotá. The focus is routes, hubs, financing, logistics, maritime corridors, air corridors, and transnational networks. This can be framed as protecting Americans. It can be presented as interdiction, enforcement, and disruption. And it can be conducted with a mix of overt and covert instruments. The Venezuela precedent plays an indirect role here. It creates psychological reinforcement. If Washington believes bold action worked once, it becomes easier to justify bolder action again, especially when the story is this is about drugs. Scenario 4. Colombia is next as a political target ahead of the 2026 election cycle. This is important, and it's often underestimated. Colombia has a major political calendar ahead. In election cycles, external pressure can reshape internal dynamics. It can polarize society. It can consolidate support around sovereignty. It can also fracture coalitions if elites begin to fear isolation and financial consequences. In this scenario, Washington does not need tanks. It needs leverage. It needs pressure points. It needs narratives. It needs to make the cost of a certain political line feel too high and the cost of a different line feel more acceptable. This is how great powers often operate when they want change but prefer to avoid direct war. Scenario 5. A Venezuela-style military scenario inside Colombia. This is the one people talk about because it is the most dramatic. After Venezuela, many automatically assume if they did it there, they can do it anywhere. But here is the sober reality. The price will be much higher. Colombia is more complex institutionally. The regional reaction would be sharper because this would look like action against a country that has long been integrated into U.S. security cooperation, not a fully isolated regime. The anti-American backlash could become stronger across Latin America. The diplomatic cost could become wider. And within the U.S., after the controversy surrounding the Venezuela precedent, repeating the method against Colombia could trigger a deeper political crisis around legality, legitimacy, and strategic wisdom. So yes, it is possible in theory, but in terms of rational incentives, it is far from the most likely. That is why I think the best way to frame the central question is slightly different. Instead of asking, will Colombia be next in the sense of a night raid on a presidential palace? Ask, will Colombia be next as the next stage of pressure, where Washington combines sanctions, threats, and operational moves to force political outcomes without a formal invasion? Now, what would sharply raise the risk of a harder scenario? Trigger 1. A breakdown of practical counter-narcotics cooperation. As long as Bogotá signals willingness to cooperate, Washington can claim that existing channels still function. But if cooperation collapses, if intelligence sharing stops, if access to operational mechanisms shrinks, Washington gains a powerful argument. We must act ourselves because the partner refuses. Trigger 2. Escalation of the sanctions track from symbolic to systemic. When sanctions move from a limited political message to a broader financial architecture, it often signals preparation for tougher measures. It becomes part of a strategy, not a gesture. Trigger 3. The precedent effect inside Washington. If decision-makers conclude that Venezuela was politically profitable at home and manageable abroad, the temptation to repeat the approach grows. But at the same time, repeating the approach accelerates a dangerous transformation. What was once an exception becomes a norm. And when force becomes a norm, the entire regional security architecture changes. Countries start planning around the possibility that U.S. power might be used not only against enemies, but also against partners. That is how trust erodes, quietly at first, then suddenly. So here is the conclusion that matters for an American audience. Colombia is already in the orbit of Trump's hard rhetoric. The country is already being framed inside the U.S. political narrative through the lens of drugs and threat. And Colombian officials already respond as if the sovereignty question is real. But next will most likely mean the next phase of pressure, not the exact repeat of the Venezuela operation. Sanctions, coercive diplomacy, enforcement actions around narcotics logistics, and a strategic bet on internal political change ahead of Colombia's 2026 elections. And that raises a practical question for every American viewer. At what price will Washington pursue results? Because the lesson of Venezuela is simple. Force rarely ends when the operation ends. It opens a tab, and that tab is later paid in politics, money, regional instability, and long-term strategic consequences. That is the real story here. Not only whether Colombia is next, but what kind of America is being built through these precedents, and how far this new playbook is willing to go. I'm Vali Alibayov. Thanks for watching.